Welcome back to The Bulwark Goes to Hollywood. My name is Sonny Budge. I'm culture editor at The Bulwark. And I'm very pleased to be rejoined by Sean O'Connell. Sean, we had him on to talk about his book about the Snyder Cut that came out. Was that last year? Has it already been a year?
March of 2021. Yeah. March of 2021.
Wow. Time flies. We had him on to discuss that book. He is back to discuss his new book, With Great Power, How Spider-Man Conquered Hollywood During the Golden Age of Comic Book Blockbusters, which is out now. You can get it for the Spider fan in your life. Put it in under the Christmas tree in the stocking. It's a nice compendium, kind of explaining Spider-Man's place in the cinematic landscape and ecosystem, and kind of contextualizing it with everything else that is going on. Sean, thank you for being on the show. I really appreciate it.
Of course, happy to be here.
So let's talk about Spider-Man movie star. And before we get to the first big Spider-Man movie in 2002, directed by Sam Raimi, there were all sorts of starts and stops and things that people kind of half remember but don't quite fully understand. So what was the actual first Spider movie out there?
Well, the first one technically goes to 2 episodes of the Nicholas Hammond television show that ran in the 1960s. And that show was kind of produced because Bill Bixby's Incredible Hulk show was popular. And they were trying to get Marvel characters to show up in primetime. But the Hammond show never really caught on. He blames scheduling. He just blames that they never had a consistent time to air. You would get an episode in October, and then the next one might not be till December. So the audience never really knew when to tune into it. But what the network did was they packaged 2 episodes together, and they would show them as movies in international territories. So in the UK and in Mexico, there would be fans who thought that they were seeing a Spider-Man movie. And then Hammond would tell me, actually, I got a chance to speak with Nicholas Hammond for the book, and he would say he would go to these comic book conventions around the world and get approached by fans to sign these movie stand-ups or movie posters, because to them, they were seeing the first Spider-Man movie. And I have a really close friend of mine who grew up in Mexico, who didn't think that the Sam Raimi movie in 2002 was the first Spider-Man movie, because he was like, no, I remember distinctly going to a theater as a kid and seeing this Spider-Man on the big screen. And so, that goes to show why he's such a worldwide phenomena and how early people were getting a chance to see him on the big screen.
Well, there's an interesting chicken and an egg situation in your book that you discuss a little bit. Is Spider-Man popular because he's popular, or was he popular because he was licensed everywhere? I mean, it's an interesting story about the early years of Marvel, and it's one of the reasons, frankly, why the Spider rights are such a mess, is because Marvel was selling rights to Spider stuff everywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. And Sonny, the thing is, I don't have the answer to that. I'm not sure that anybody does. It really is, it's almost like when you talk about the start of the MCU, and if Marvel Studios owned the rights to Spider-Man, would they have started with him? Because he is the most worldwide recognizable and somewhat relatable character, but they had to start with Iron Man. I just think if you think back to your childhood, everybody of a certain age, I'm in my late 40s, Spider-Man was prevalent when we were kids. He was in animated television shows. The 1960s show was probably still playing in syndication. He would be in Spider-Man and the Amazing Friends. He just was a popular character for people to tell stories for, way more so than someone like an Iron Man or a Captain America that didn't really pop up in different media. But you can even think about just how much Spider-Man was involved in toys and lunchboxes and all these different places where the company put him. You could say that they were almost like forcing him down our throats at some point, but he was just popular and again, relatable. And while we talk about the Hulk, having his show, which was definitely groundbreaking at that time and still has some cultural impact. People talk about the Hulk at that point. It really was the push for Spider-Man, and especially in that sort of late 80s, early 90s, as they were working towards getting a Spider-Man project up and running. Even though Blade and the X-Men sort of dropped at the same time that Spider-Man did, it was Spider-Man that just skyrocketed to global phenomena. It's because of, people look at that character and they find him relatable.
Yeah. So then we move on to the again. There's a kind of period of disputed rights that runs through much of the 80s and 90s. Golan and Globus, the guys who were making movies with Cannon. And then James Cameron, of course, takes a crack at it. Really wants to tell us the Cameron story. Obviously, James Cameron very much in the news right now with with Avatar, The Way of Water hitting theaters here in a week or so. But he almost made a Spider-Man movie.
One of the reasons why I wanted to write this book is because there are different signposts throughout the course of Spider-Man's history that if certain things had happened, we would have gone down a different road, and it might have changed, not just the superhero comic book story genre, but the film industry as a whole. And Cameron's is a great example. He was, around the time of Terminator and T2, and was looking for his next project. He's been a comic book fan his entire life. He seemed like the type of director that you would want to get involved in the superhero genre because of the way that he blends visual effects with his storytelling. And he had been pitched or he went in to pitch an X-Men movie with Catherine Bigelow at the time. She was going to direct it and he was going to produce. And instead, Stan Lee kind of said, I hear you also like Spider-Man. And that was it. Like if Cameron, once he found out the Spider-Man was available, he kind of went down that road. So there is a treatment that exists out there, and it's about 28, 29 pages that you can read through of how he would have laid out Spider-Man's origin. And in that treatment, there are different things that then show up in the Sam Raimi origin story, like the idea of making the web spinners organic to Peter, and not being the mechanized thing that goes on his wrists. That was Cameron's idea originally. There were conversations of him maybe working with DiCaprio as his Peter Parker and potentially wanting Arnold Schwarzenegger to play his Otto Octavius. Who knows if these things would have come to pass. But it's just because Cameron couldn't get the rights freed up. Like he begged Fox to try to get in there and spend the money that they would have had to spend to claim the theatrical rights. And they didn't want to put up the $5 million or something that it would have cost in order to get them. And Cameron's like, you don't understand, you're sitting on $1 billion idea here. And so, when I think about that, because instead he didn't make the Spider-Man movie and he went on to make Titanic. Now, if he doesn't do that, how different is the film industry moving forward? How much power does Cameron have? What if he did 3 Spider-Man movies in a row because the first one took off? It's just, I love looking at those big picture things and just thinking how different things could have been, the what ifs of the Hollywood history there.
Or what if he made one Spider-Man movie and then didn't make another one for 13 years, which is also possible. I think
that's his time frame.
But no, I mean, it is fascinating. It's fascinating to think about. I mean, and as you mentioned, at this time, Marvel's in a very weird place. This is obviously well before they're bought by Disney. This is, kind of in the midst of the 1990s comic boom, but also like as that wave is cresting and coming down. And, at this point, Marvel's actually owned by a toy company.
Yes, Toy Biz was the company, and that's Avi Arad and Ike Perlmutter, who, if you have a passing knowledge of the comic book movies and the contributions of these people, Avi gets, a lot of heat for decisions that he's made, creative decisions that he helped to sort of push as the movies went on. But I try to emphasize in the book, because I honestly believe this, he is, essential to the formation of Marvel films, because he was the one in those early stages knocking on the studio doors, and he went from New York to Los Angeles specifically because he knew that the future of those Marvel characters was in movies. Now, he absolutely considered the movies to be long-form commercials for the toys that they were going to sell. And his partner, Ike Perlmutter, who was a nickel and dimer, hated how much Avi thought he had to spend to look like a player in Hollywood. But that's why the Marvel rights were divided up amongst multiple studios at the time, because Avi would get a deal with 20th Century Fox to make an X-Men movie and a deal with New Line to make a Blade movie. But no studio would go all in on the pitch of, here are all of our characters, will you please take them? And what breaks my heart is there's a story in the book about how Sony had an opportunity at one point to own the entire library, except for the ones that were available at Fox, which was the X-Men and Fantastic Four. And Sony said, no, we have no interest in all those other characters. We only want Spider-Man. And they just balked at the price tag for it, which I think at that time was about $25 million. And if you think about the fact that Sony could have been where Disney is now, had they just taken a gamble and bought all those characters. But that's how they ended up with Spider-Man and are still holding on to Spider-Man, although the book gets into how they eventually learned to collaborate with Marvel.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny to think like $25 million is, one half of one Robert Downey Jr. paycheck
Yes, yeah, right.
towards the tail end of his run at Marvel. Just a crazy figure. All right, so we as we go along here, we start getting into the comic book era, and I'm a big Blade guy. I always say Blade is the forgotten movie, that really kicked off the whole Marvel boom.
Sure.
And obviously X-Men. I like everybody remembers. I remember reading Wizard magazine when the X-Men movie was being made and like following, like, oh my god, they were actually going to do this. It's going to be amazing. Right. And it was fine. But Spider-Man is the big the big movie that really kicks off the whole blockbuster era of superhero filmmaking. Tell us about the business response to that, because I mean I do think that I think your book. I mean, we'll see how the future progresses, but I do think your book makes a credible argument that we have basically bracketed this superhero era with Spider-Man and then No Way Home,
right.
at one end and the other.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
So tell us about the making of Spider-Man and kind of the business response to that.
Well, one of the things that I really wanted to get at when putting together, especially the stuff around Raimi's first movie, is just the work that went into translating that character from the page of a comic book to live action, because I really felt that it was the first movie. Donner's Superman gets a lot of credit for convincing people that that character was flying, and then Burton's first Batman movie was a very, very popular film and extremely successful in the marketplace, but had Tim Burton's stamp all over it. But I think that Raimi's Spider-Man was the first one that was as close to comic accurate and really treated the source material with the sort of reverence that now we see on a regular basis to these movies. It's essentially Amazing Fantasy number 15, which is Spider-Man's first appearance, retold through Raimi's filter. And so I wanted to speak with people like John Dykstra, who was the head of visual effects, and Don Burgess, who was the production designer working with Raimi, because I felt like the decisions that they had made early on in 2002 or 2001, 2002 to create this world created a blueprint for how movies going forward had to remain as faithful as possible to the source material, because they created a New York that looked like it came right out of the Stan Lee, Steve Ditko early 1960s comics. Tobey Maguire was the nerdy Peter Parker, who couldn't get the girl and who was kind of bullied by Flash Thompson. And those elements remained. They kept the heart and the core of what was important to Spider-Man. And, you think about right before that, you were seeing things like Dolph Lundgren's Punisher and movies that sort of played fast and loose with the rules of it. But I think that first Spider-Man movie connected with the global audience that it did because of how faithful it was to the stories. And now Amy Pascal, who's been a producer on these Spider-Man movies since the first one, she is the first one to admit, and I think she's learning a lot from Kevin Feige, that the books are there, as the source material to lean on, and they're successful because of, what's in the books. So just stick to it, tell those stories and hit those character beats, and then your movie should succeed. The further you get away from what makes the book special, what makes Marvel, the globally adored company that it is that the stories that they're putting together work so well for those heroes, and when the movies adapt them properly, then I think they take off, and that's what I think Raimi did.
Yeah, I mean, it is it's interesting to go back and watch some of those the first Raimi movies, in part because I rewatched them before No Way Home came out, and I saw Kevin Feige's name come up. I was like, oh, that's interesting. He's been here since the beginning.
Yes.
Good for him. But also, just like the images in that movie really are ripped from the pages of a comic book in a way that I just don't think had been done prior to that. The one that always jumps out at me is the in the final fight with Goblin. There's this shot of Spider-Man with like half his mask torn off, and I'm like, I remember Todd McFarlane drawing that, in 1989 or whatever. It made me feel old, but also, I did. But I do wonder from your. I mean, look, you're a fan. I say this with all due respect, a nerd like me. You kind of
Of course.
I do wonder if there has been if things have gone too far to appeal to the fans too much. Do you ever get that sense from folks you talk to, or on the creative side of things, that they worry about pandering a little bit too much to people like us?
Absolutely. I mean, if you go back to those early Raimi films, it's something like social media didn't exist. So you couldn't get the instant wave of feedback, in terms of how your stuff is being accepted or rejected. And you think about the Disney Plus shows, which I think right now, the Marvel Disney Plus shows cater significantly to trying to get certain characters, out into the marketplace but I'm not quite sure that Marvel knows how they're going to be using them moving forward. So in this case, like where you might see a Moon Knight or a Miss Marvel and enjoy that storyline, there's no bigger picture, there's no bigger plan for how they're going to be rolled in. I kind of liked when Marvel was, and it's not that I don't like what the MCU is doing now, but I liked when Marvel was doing standalone movies that it didn't have to tease into the next 4 or 5 other projects that that are building to a bigger franchise. And that's some of the things I talk a little bit about in the book, is how other companies like Warner Brothers and Sony made the mistake of trying to chase after that universe building, and how it was to their detriment because they couldn't. I do think Marvel has had some breaks along the way. Like there are places when the Marvel Cinematic Universe probably should have gone off the rails, and maybe it's Kevin Feige, and maybe it's just the luck of when certain films came out. But they managed to keep it all together for the Infinity Saga. Now you're right; it is more fan service. It is more the inclusion of certain characters who may never pay off. Like Harry Styles will show up in the end credit scene of Eternals. We don't know if we're ever going to see the Eternals again, let alone whoever character was introduced. So maybe they do need to rein it back. Maybe they need to get it a little bit under control, or potentially it's part of a bigger picture that Kevin Feige knows and we just don't right now.
Yeah, I do remember watching the Eternals and for the first time being stumped by a character introduction. Just being like, who is Harry Styles here? I don't understand. I have no idea what's happening right now.
How weird is it that we both know Pip the Troll, but don't know who Harry Styles is playing? It's unusual.
So let's. Again, one of the interesting what ifs in the story is what if Spider-Man 4. You with Sam Raimi. You looked at some of the storyboards for that, right? You talk about that a little bit in the book.
I did, yes. I got a chance to interview Jeffrey Henderson, who did a lot of the creative work behind the scenes on putting that story together and was working hand in hand with Raimi to try to do what he looked at what he viewed as like a redeeming project. He wanted to get back to the heart of the first 2 Spider-Man movies after part 3 really, was bogged down by a bunch of decisions that weren't necessarily Raimi's. It's famous now at this point that he didn't like Venom as a character, and that this is where Avi Arad gets a lot of his flack, is because he believed that Venom was an extremely popular character with the kids and that it would sell a lot of toys, and that was his gut instinct, was to push it forward. And I get Avi, to admit in the book that he probably, was wrong to push Sam to do a villain that he didn't have his heart behind. And so, but it's interesting, Sonny, is that, at the time before the Marvel Sony Spider-Man films, Spider-Man 3 was the highest grossing one in the franchise up to that point. So while it's critically, ridiculed and fans will point at it as the low point, it was a blockbuster phenomena and gave Sony a bit of a, overconfidence, I think, to say that, like, hey, anything that we put out that has Spider-Man's name on it is going to do really, really well. And that feeds into what might have gone wrong with Andrew's franchise as they tried to get that off the ground.
Yeah, let's move to the Amazing Spider-Man series of movies. Two movies directed by Mark Webb that follow the Raimi films and are kind of before Tom Holland goes into the MCU. A bit of almost a bit of a lost period for some folks. I mean, these were still massive grossers, still made lots of money, but not enough money, which is why that whole experiment came to an end. I get the sense from reading your book that Andrew Garfield is almost a tragic, heroic figure in this story. He's a guy who loves Spider-Man, who really wanted to do it, and is just getting hemmed in at every avenue by things he doesn't want to do or things that aren't good for the character.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And it is, like, not that I'm trying to say Toby took the part, just because it was a part, but I don't think that he had the passion for the character the way that Andrew did coming into the role. Like, Andrew's a legitimate diehard Spider-Man fan, grew up on the character and wanted to do right by it, really cared what the fans thought of his interpretation and wanted to pour his passion into it. But this was also what I found pretty interesting in putting the timeline together of the films, is how the movies that came right before the ones that had been made would affect the decisions that were being made to do so. So, say for like the Amazing Spider-Man, they wanted to specifically make sure they did things that didn't mirror the Raimi films, and then by the time you get to Tom Holland and the MCU, they want to do things that are completely different from the other two franchises that come before it. So not only are you dealing with like fan expectation, but you're dealing with just creative choices that you have to make because of the movies that came before it. And so with the Amazing Spider-Man, they go far more grounded. That was, you remember the period of films that came after the Nolan Batman films. Everybody was going for dark and gritty. So they tried to filter Spider-Man's story through dark and gritty. It's interesting with Andrew too. I think his Peter Parker was never quite the nerd. Like, he's an outcast, but I'm not calling that kid uncool. Yeah. He's still, yeah. I'd want to hang out with that kid if I was at his school. They have to choose villains that hadn't been shown up before. So he gets saddled with like the Lizard, who's not the most compelling villain. And then the problem with Amazing Spider-Man 2, I believe, is that Amy Pascal kind of saw the writing on the wall that like they were losing the fan base, or they didn't quite know 100% what to do with the character. So in Amazing Spider-Man 2, they tried very hard to launch the cinematic universe with just one film. And by the time before that movie had even hit theaters, they had parts 3 and 4 announced on the calendar. They had Drew Goddard, who had done Cabin in the Woods, was working on a Sinister Six movie. Like, they were just putting the cart way before the horse and saying, this is what we're going to do. And then it all fell apart when, as you said, they didn't make enough money. And it's funny that like we still see that problem now. Like, Black Adam is facing that problem right now of they're teasing out a Black Adam and Superman movie, but we are learning that Black Adam didn't do that well at theaters, and so we may never see that film again. And this happens in the comic book genre all too often, and again, sort of cut Andrew's franchise off at the knees.
Yeah, I mean, it's again, it's fascinating to go back and watch that movie because there are like 6 different films in it. There are
yeah.
There are I at the time I was angry, and I'm still kind of annoyed by it. That they basically toss in the death of Gwen Stacy plotline as a like tertiary plot. It is just like it is buried under 6 different stories. And I there's no wonder it didn't work. I mean, it just is. It had strong Dark Universe vibes, is how I like to think of it.
That's a good way to put it, for sure. Yes. And I mean, yeah, like you point out, there's so many subplots that are just arguing, elbowing each other out of the way for space. And I think that there are things in Amazing Spider-Man 2 that work really, really well. But you can't overlook the things that just they don't go anywhere. And so, yeah, it became a weird sort of Frankenstein mishmash that eventually led to what I think is a really, groundbreaking partnership, which is Sony agreeing to turn one of their characters over to a competing studio. Like, I try to emphasize in the book, and I still don't know if I get the point across. Like, that just doesn't happen. Yeah. A studio doesn't give up one of their assets, a major IP to a rival. But Sony looked across the street and just said, Marvel's doing so well with this. Let's figure this out.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit, because you're right. It's fascinating. Like, this is a huge partnership. It's obviously very interesting. There are lots of ins and outs here. But the thing that I learned from your book, I actually didn't know this, was that Marvel was in charge of casting Spider-Man,
yes.
Casting Tom Holland as Spider-Man, which I probably should have known, but I did not realize that was done by a Marvel casting director specifically for Civil War.
Yeah, Sarah Finn, who is in charge of most of the casting at Marvel. And honestly, Sonny, it's just Amy Pascal had reached a point where she just stopped trusting her instincts, and had to turn over as much of it to Kevin Feige, because the decisions that she was making were proving to not work necessarily, even though she had the best intentions at hand. She didn't go into Amazing Spider-Man trying to make bad movies, without a doubt. She loves the character. She really wishes that it worked out at Sony, and especially for Andrew. And that's kind of why I love so much how No Way Home gives him, a bit of a redemptive arc. But they had to turn over everything to Kevin Feige and just say, like, what you're doing is working, so please help us with Spider-Man, make him work. And there are, notes passed between Amy and Kevin that just say, like, please come save, this character. Please save him from what I've done to him. They tried to get Sam Raimi to come back and say, please help us save Peter. We've lost our way with him, essentially. But turning him over completely to the MCU and just letting him make those decisions is what has gotten us to where we are with Tom Holland.
Yeah. So let's talk about that deal. How did that deal actually work on a financial level? What was the revenue split like? Because it's a really interesting deal that they set up between the two shops.
So Sony essentially would distribute the films, but Disney was going to do Disney and Marvel were going to do everything creatively in order to make them happen. And so there was a marketing share, and then there's a merchandise share that gave Sony essentially 95% of everything that was earned, and that Marvel would get 5% of what they took home. But it allowed them to use Spider-Man in their movies, and essentially they needed him for Infinity War and Endgame. Those are the places where they necessarily wanted to set him up. And for that opportunity, and to appear in Captain America Civil War. For that, they would creatively help out with Spider-Man Homecoming and Spider-Man Far From Home, and then what would eventually become No Way Home. But before No Way Home, the deal even fell through a bit because Disney pushed back and said, hey, we want more of a 50-50 split because we think that we're doing all the work here. And not only are we doing all the work and you guys are just distributing these pictures, but Kevin Feige is tied up in so many other projects. He's trying to shepherd the Disney Plus series forward. He's got all these Marvel Phase 4 and Phase 5 movies. And they just figured Sony would kowtow to them and say, like, oh, of course, we'll go with the 50-50 split. Just please keep helping us. And Sony, to their credit, they were like, no, that's okay. We'll keep Spider-Man, and you guys, good luck. Keep doing what you're doing. And for a little while, not very long, a couple of weeks maybe, the deal was off, and Spider-Man was back over at Sony. And this was after Far From Home, so No Way Home was not happening yet. And the fans started to freak out. And to be honest, Tom Holland started to freak out a little bit because he was like, hey, things are going really well over at Marvel. I really like collaborating with those guys. But now you're going back over to Sony. And Sony at that point had kind of proven that they didn't necessarily know how to handle the character correctly. And in fact, what they were doing on their own was creating these Venom films and maybe rolling out Morbius, which was going to be, it looked bad from the get-go. And so, but then they were able to sort of rectify what had happened and then piece everything back together.
So there, it's funny. There's a story I remember from when this happened. There's a funny story in your book about Holland and Bob Iger kind of getting in touch with each other to try and mend the fences here.
Well, what I loved about this too is because right before that happened, Tom Holland essentially goes to D23, and he's promoting Pixar's film Onward, of which he was voicing characters with Chris Pratt and Julia Louis-Dreyfus. And he tells the story that he went backstage at the convention at Anaheim, and there were a bunch of Marvel guys there, Marvel actors, and they were all getting together and taking pictures. And Tom Holland says to himself, like, am I even contractually allowed to like show up in pictures with these guys? Like, he didn't even know where he stood between the two studios. So he goes off to London, kind of dejected, goes back home. He's in this kind of limbo where he thinks now he's going to be in Sony's universe and he doesn't get to play in the Marvel sandbox anymore. And he reaches out to Bob Iger's assistant and just says, hey, if I can get a chance to get on the phone with Bob, I just want to thank him for the opportunity he gave me and letting me come over and be Spider-Man in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which was really historic. He was going to be Spider-Man in the MCU, and that's going to go down in history as that way forever, and was beloved. Like, he was definitely, people loved his interpretation of it. And a couple of days go by and he doesn't hear anything back from Iger, who's of course extremely busy. And then Tom gets a cell phone call one night when he's out at a pub at trivia night, which he is a huge fan of doing trivia night here in London. I'm actually in London right now as we're speaking. And he's a couple of pints in at this point, the way he describes it. And he answers the phone regardless, and it's Bob Iger, and he kind of gives this gushing pitch of just why they should figure out a way to work together. He loves being Spider-Man. He thinks the MCU needs Spider-Man moving forward. Can they figure out a way to work it out? And whether Bob Iger was just moved by the pitch or whether he also agreed that it was in everyone's best interest, to keep Spider-Man in the MCU, Iger and Kevin Feige and all the executives over at Sony came up with a compromise that is at least going to allow Tom to appear in a few more films and then make No Way Home, which, ended up becoming one of the highest grossing movies of all time.
Yeah, which kind of brings me to my parting thought here, which is that I do wonder if Spider-Man both like kind of kicks off and ends the era of total comic book dominance, because I just don't know that we will ever see. I mean, look, this is a fool's game here to predict what will happen in the world of box office and any of that. But I do wonder if the creation of Disney Plus combined with just general Marvel fatigue, et cetera, has led to a point where I don't know that we will ever have another nearly $2 billion grossing comic book movie like that. I wonder if this is it. I mean, I'm not going to ask you to make a prediction yourself here, but I'm just curious what you make of the landscape now as it sits.
I completely agree with you. Not that the bloom is fully off the rose, but it's not nearly as engrossing in the casual landscape, as it's always going to appeal to, I think, nerds like us who are just interested in what Marvel is doing next kind of thing. But we're at a stage now where fans are admitting that they skip movies, or don't even engage with some of the television shows. And that wasn't the case with Marvel. Like when Marvel was going through phases 1 through 3, every single thing that they put out was, the center of attention. And they can still put out, it's remarkable that they put out a Doctor Strange movie a Doctor Strange sequel, that will earn as much money as it does. And we're seeing things in the MCU that fans could have never dreamed possible. Like Namor is attacking Wakanda, in a Marvel movie. Who would have thought we would ever get to that point? But I think you're right. I mean, I talk about the golden age of comic book movies, and I didn't believe this when I was writing it necessarily, because I think I didn't sort of lift my head up to kind of pay that much attention to what was happening. But I do think it's kind of coming to a close, or slowing down at the very least. And I don't know what will replace it, but we see genres come and go in Hollywood all the time, and you could point to like the Western that lasted for 50 some odd years or something, and people still make the random Western nowadays, a contemporary Western. But there's a saturation. There's such a saturation in the market because you can look to Amazon Prime with The Boys, or Peacemaker going over to HBO Max, and any streaming platform you got on, people are trying to get some type of superhero story going out there, and that's in addition to the stuff that DC is doing and the Sony universe that they're doing with like all these spider related characters that I mentioned, branching into animation with Into the Spider-Verse and all these different things. And it's, after a while, it does, even as someone who like me who loves it all, it gets to be too much. And so you could look at No Way Home as almost like the bookend to it if you consider Raimi's first one to be one of the pioneers.
Yeah. All right, that was everything I wanted to ask you, or everything I wanted to talk about. What did I fail to ask? What do you think folks should know about Spider-Man? Your book? I mean, we just touched on some of the hits here. If there's anything you think folks should know more about, let me know.
One of the things that I just love the most about it is that everybody who worked on Spider-Man at different levels, their passion for it, I think, shines through. And especially as we get into the No Way Home stuff, which broke such ground, to bring back in Toby and Andrew and to hear them talk about, like, that was one of the most fun parts of this book, is writing that stuff, because I was getting so close to having to deliver the manuscript, but all the No Way Home stuff was happening at that moment. So I was able to get a lot of really fresh quotes in about these guys talking about how important it was for them to return to the franchise. And in a way, that movie was like proving my point. It was proving of how successful Spider-Man is and how much he means to different people and why he is such a global phenomenon. And those guys talking about the impact that these movies have had on their career and their audiences, I think just went, further in terms of like backing up my premise, which is that no one else is like Spider-Man out there. The closest thing is probably Batman, in terms of the number of films that are made about him and the different ways that he branches into animation and television and stuff like that. But Spider-Man holds a very special place, and I'm not quite sure that we're going to see another character that comes close to replicating what they've been able to do with him in terms of Hollywood storytelling. And so I hope that I gave his story justice.
All right, Sean, thank you for being on the show. Again, this is Sean O'Connell. His book is With Great Power, How Spider-Man Conquered Hollywood During the Golden Age of Comic Blockbusters. Comic book blockbusters, I'm sorry. And it's available on Amazon. I'll link to it in the email. You go check it out there. And pick it up for the Spider fan in your life for Christmas. My name is Sonny Bunch. I am culture editor at the Bulwark, and I will be back next week with another episode of The Bulwark Goes to Hollywood. See you guys then.